I had the good fortune to visit Singapore a couple weeks ago. And you know, as they say, it's a fine city. No, but seriously, some of the nicest people, the best food, beautiful places. The weather was really humid, and there were even monitor lizards crawling around on the beaches. So, you know, everything you could ever want. If I was a cool YouTuber, I'd make a travel video and talk about all the food that I ate and the people that I met and the things that I saw, but I'm not, so I won't. But what I will do is show some videos and photos as I jabber about today's book selection, which is Sons of the Yellow Emperor by Lynn Pan. I bought this book some years ago and I didn't have a chance to read it, and I thought, 6-hour plane ride from Japan to Singapore? It's a good chance to catch up on some reading. This book is really interesting. It not only has a lot of information about the history of Chinese immigration to places like Singapore, and actually many countries all over the world, but it also details everything from the daily lives of the Chinese coolies or the laborers, the way the Chinatowns were constructed and the secret societies that flourished there, and the intense working conditions and the outright horrible lives of Chinese workers from Australia to Java to Africa to all over the United States and Europe. More than 30 million people of Chinese descent are scattered throughout the world in more than 100 countries. And this book takes a look at the history of that immigration and the socio and economic factors behind it and how we got to where we are today. One of the things that I like about this book is that it goes into detail about a lot of the forgotten historical figures that we just never learn about in school, the Chinese businessmen, the entrepreneurs, and even the slave traders that really shaped Chinese immigration worldwide. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in here. This is a huge book, 389 pages, not counting all of the indexes and works cited and so forth at the end. But it's actually a really interesting overview of so many subjects that you would just never think of. Yes, it's about the Chinese diaspora, but it's also about food, it's about technology, it's about human relationships. She also details a lot of the parallels between the African slave trade and the Chinese coolie trade. There's a lot to cover here, but I'm going to try to break it down as best I can. So let's dive in. I like these kind of books that synthesize large amounts of information, all the historical figures and the movements of people and all of the socioeconomic factors and trades, and that way I feel like I don't have to read the like the works cited page. I mean, look at this stuff. How many pages of this even are there? And some of these books actually look interesting, but will I ever read them? Nah. So while this book is densely packed with information, it's highly readable. I was sucked into this from the very first chapter, where she describes the Ming dynasty of China in the late 16th century. What's interesting about that time is that China was actually starting to build a navy, and they were looking at the ocean to try to see if they could gain naval supremacy. Between 1405 and 1433, in a spectacular display of seamanship, 7 imperial exhibitions sailed into the waters of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, calling it some 40 states and enrolling many of them as Chinese tributaries. The first of the voyages took them to Java, Sumatra, Malacca, Siam, Ceylon, and the west coast of southern India. Later fleets ventured as far as the Persian Gulf, Aden, East Africa, and the south coast of Arabia. Made more than 60 years before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and discovered the Indian Ocean, Cheng Ho's expeditions, had they been fired by a zeal equal to that of their Iberian counterparts, might well have made the Chinese supreme in the seas between Burma and Goa. But the journeys proved a drain on the nation, and what Cheng Ho had started was never followed up. China never became a sea power, nor did it, as imperial European nations were later to do, sponsor colonies or movements of overseas migration. What an interesting alternative history we would have if China had continued along that route and had built up trade ports in places like the Philippines or throughout Southeast Asia, or had even connected a new kind of Silk Road by the sea. This is actually echoed in the epilogue as well, where she writes, "For some 2,000 years, the security problem of the empire has been to guard the inner Asian frontier against the incursions of the nomads of the grasslands from beyond the Great Wall. For 2,000 years, China looked inwards to the steppes and deserts of Asia, and more perhaps to itself. It habitually turned its back to the sea, and when troubles came from there, as they did in the form of piracy during the 17th century, the court reacted not by looking outwards, but by closing the frontier, banning foreign trade and travel, and depopulating the coast." Yeah, actually, she writes in here about China actually was so frustrated by some of the pirate attacks that would come in, that they actually moved whole villages like up into the mountains away from the coasts and forced people to leave their homes, and the fishermen couldn't be fishermen anymore. Now they had to be farmers, and it's a really kind of fascinating, bizarre history. And so I'd like to read you a passage about the old school pirates of the 15th and 16th centuries. "Some of the first places abroad to be settled by the Chinese were thus freebooters' lairs and havens. A well-known example was Taiwan, an island off the southern coast of Fujian province, not annexed by the Chinese Empire until 1683. With the removal of the trade restrictions, the well-beaten path between Fujian province and Taiwan was followed by merchants, hunters, artisans, and farmers. Another favorite anchorage of the sea rovers was Patani, a port in what is now southern Thailand. In the 16th century, it served as the headquarters of a number of Chinese sea pirates, notably the notorious Lin Pan, a wanted outlaw who escaped to Siam from Fujian with a band of some 2,000 men. These pirates became the nucleus of a Chinese colony in Patani, from which port they and other buccaneer bands plotted their raids on the China coast, and there is a tradition that Lin married the daughter of a Malay chief and became a ruler himself." The early chapters of this book, especially part 1, 1500 to 1870, which is a huge amount of time, can feel a little overwhelming at times. But Miss Pan does her best to keep things moving along. It's just a ton of information. But I like this kind of thing, like as an aspiring writer, I'm really interested in world building. And I feel like reading nonfiction books like this, where huge swaths of history are sort of summarized and broken down so that you can maybe imagine what kind of giant social forces are pushing people around, and people who are caught up in the movements of history, what they're going through, and you can kind of extrapolate from there. Another overwhelming point of the first part is the geography. I would often have a Google map open while I was reading, just to make sure like I knew exactly where everything was. She does have some maps at the beginning of the book, but I found that, I wanted to kind of keep in my mind where exactly these places were in relation to the others. All right, I'm going to move right over to part 2, because I want to keep this moving along. This is a gigantic book. There's a lot to cover here. Another interesting thing, just as a background in part 2, is the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Statue of Liberty were basically around the exact same time. I think the Chinese Exclusion Act was 2 years after the Statue of Liberty was dedicated, so that's some irony. In the 1870s, America was screaming about the problem of Chinese immigration, and they were trying to stop Chinese immigration through these laws and trying to pass all of this legislation. But Lynn Pan demonstrates that only 4.5% of all immigrants entering the United States around that time were Chinese, and all of the others were from other countries. So it was largely blown out of proportion. And of course, Chinese people were helping to build the railroads. They were, setting up Chinese laundries and Chinese restaurants, and doing a lot of the manual labor and a lot of the trade. They were doing a lot of the jobs that other people did not want to do, and for very low pay, and in some cases with no pay. Now let me talk a little bit about Arnold Genthe. Arnold Genthe is a very fascinating guy. He was a German photographer who came to San Francisco and took a lot of photos. And actually, the San Francisco earthquake destroyed so much of Chinatown, and miraculously, his photographs survived. They survived the earthquake of 1906. And so it's quite fascinating to see some of the photographs actually are included in here. She also has a number of different sections that talk about Chinatowns. And it's really interesting. She goes through several different Chinatowns. She also talks about the history of Chinatowns, and in San Francisco being the first American Chinatown, and also the Limehouse in England. Let me read you a passage about the mystery of Fu Manchu, because a lot of people who think about the Chinese diaspora, think about the Yellow Menace, and some of the fears that Western people had of Chinese people. In 1911, a prolific English novelist called Arthur Henry Sarsfield Ward was commissioned to write a thriller about the Chinese criminal underworld in Limehouse. Writing as Sax Rohmer, he created the most potent of the Chinaman fictional villains by publishing The Mystery of Fu Manchu, a novel that ran to more than 40 editions in Britain and America and spawned some 13 sequels. Fu Manchu was the Yellow Peril incarnate, the evil genius plotting to take over the world. Whether or not we are to believe Rohmer when he said that the character was inspired by a chance view of a well-dressed, unusually tall Chinese he saw getting into a limousine in Limehouse Causeway on a foggy night, there's no doubt that Limehouse's reputation had something to do with its creation. That reputation owed its unsavoriness to opium, or more accurately, to the imagined squalor of a Chinese opium den. And then this is kind of interesting. She talks about how the habit of smoking opium had not always appeared so degrading in English eyes. There was an 1868 account of the Prince of Wales' visit to an opium den, but that lacked the luridness of the later depictions. And she even talks about Locke, which, as a guy from the west coast of the US, I found that to be really interesting. Locke is now an almost ghost town, but it was a completely self-sufficient Chinese-run and Chinese-founded little town. And Locke was located in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And you can still go there today. You can still see the old buildings. Connected to Chinatown, there's also a lot of interesting information here about the triads, or the secret societies, much of which have been made into movies, very exaggerated in Hong Kong action movies and a lot of Chinese gangster films. She talks here on page 117 about how some of the secret societies began and why they were able to become so powerful, especially way back at the end of the 19th century. Secret societies were organic to overseas Chinese communities. The two had gone together from the very beginning with the immigration business. It was by organizing themselves into syndicates that immigration brokers were able to acquire, control, and dispose of coolies in large numbers. Coolies, of course, being the Chinese laborers. Cho Kim Xiang, for example, was at once a coolie trader and the leader of the 5,000-strong Yi Hin, a Hokkien-speaking triad society in Malaya and Singapore. Acting as a coolie agent for at least 7 European companies, he did a roaring business recruiting laborers for Delhi in northeast Sumatra and Australia. The secret society, with its command of samsangs, or thugs, was perfectly suited to bring refractory coolies into line and stop them from absconding. From the first, the British acknowledged the fact of its usefulness as a means of social control, and there is much truth to the description of the triads as an imperium in imperio. In the early days of British rule, the Chinese largely governed themselves, dealing with the imperial power through community leaders or headmen. And these were special people, singled out for their wealth and influence, and advantageously placed by their official position to receive government contracts or favors. So the secret society and the Landmannschaft combined to form the power base, and it was frequently hard to tell where one ended and the other began. There's actually a chapter much later in the book that is just called Triads, and that's actually one of my favorite chapters in this book. And it made me think, I really want to read more books about the Chinese mafia and the triads, the secret societies, life, and back when they were smuggling opium and running gambling and prostitution. Even though the authorities were kind of looking down on that and discriminating against Chinese people, at the same time, they were allowing these things to happen. And you have a lot of sailors in London who would go to the opium dens and they would gamble with the Chinese, even though, of course, they would pretend in the daylight like they would never, ever associate with them. But there's this really interesting intermixing of all of these different cultural elements and the triad at the center of it all. Part 3 is set against the revolution in China in 1911, started by Sun Yat-sen and continued by Chiang Kai-shek. And this section of the book details a lot of the powerful men and women, a lot of the forgotten people of history who, especially Chinese men, became, very powerful entrepreneurs and businessmen. The king of the sugar industry, or the guy who started the Tiger Balm company, imports and exports of foods, which then, of course, later leads to more of the Chinatown kind of information. Really, really fascinating stuff. The women get a little bit of short shrift in here, partly because there weren't that many records of a lot of the immigrant women. You know, they were attached to the men, they were under the man's family name, and not a lot was written of them. There's not a lot of photos of them. And also, a lot of the men would not only have a wife, but then they would also later on take some concubines. And so women's place was very far beneath the man's. But even so, there's some interesting parts about the strata in society of the wealthier women versus the lower class women, which I found to be really interesting. Some of that reminded me of the book Wild Swans by Jung Chang, the complicated history, and in each successive generation, you know, people try to undo the wrongs of the past, or try to right the wrongs and make their own mistakes, and on the drama goes. I'll read you a little bit of chapter 10 here, Some of the Women. So she talks about the leisured women who lived lives of great ease and luxury, were usually surrounded by servants, and were denied very little in the way of material satisfaction. But motherhood apart, they were not offered many chances of personal fulfillment. Their place was in the home, and their contribution to the world was in their reproductive capacity. Each would have had her husband chosen for her by her elders, was usually in her teens when she went to him, and it was generally only a matter of time before she stood by while he took a concubine. And yet, though the ideal of womanhood in immigrant Chinese societies was, in most ways, the same as that which prevailed in the ancestral homeland, the very fact of her exposure to other cultures, the contrasts of style and manners afforded by her adopted country, made the moneyed overseas Chinese woman a different creature from her sisters in China. Standards were bound to be less absolute overseas, and, for all the restrictions of the feminine status, she could stand outside convention more easily than could her contemporary in the home country. If these women represented one extreme of society, the Mui Tsai, literally little sister, a Cantonese euphemism for bond maidservant, represented the other. These were girls who had been born into impoverished families, prostitutes or unmarried mothers, and sold off to rich families to be brought up as unpaid domestic servants or as future concubines for the household male masters. If she was lucky, a Mui Tsai was kindly treated, looked upon as an adopted daughter, and married off to a man of her owner's choice on reaching maturity. But many Mui Tsai were utterly at the mercy of their callous employers and lived no better than slaves. And so she says, there was scarcely a well-to-do household in Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, or Penang that did not have a Mui Tsai. And, you know, they were brought over from the coastal provinces of China. They were openly sold and bartered for, just like any kind of goods. It was almost always, as Mui Tsai, that prostitutes bought for US $70 to $150 and sold for 5 to 10 times their purchase price were imported into America during the gold rush days. One more of the interesting things I want to mention from the middle part of this book is the stereotypes of Chinese women that were perpetuated around this time. The China doll and the dragon lady never really existed as such, except in the imaginations of Western men and women. But once invented, they took on a life of their own, and when a Western man looked at a Chinese woman, all too often it was the image rather than the reality he saw. And then she goes into one of the most famous and now somewhat forgotten Chinese film stars, that is May Wong. And I have some interesting books by May Wong that just came out fairly recently. She is an absolutely fascinating person, and there's much more to her than people have given her credit for. That both Western and Eastern audiences would say that she was kind of a stereotype, and she was perpetuating stereotypes, even though Western people ate it up and Chinese people really didn't like it. But what could she do? I mean, she was accepting the roles that she was given. Instant Asia, its tourist board says of Singapore, and it is certainly true that nearly all of the diversity of the wider region can be found concentrated in the 224 square miles of the tiny republic. Yet the place does not have a confused or patchwork feeling to it, and the sort of tourist who goes round the world packaged in successively indistinguishable environments will feel instantly at home in it. The street signs are in only one script, English, and everyone of importance appears to speak English as his first language. Yeah, Singapore. Very easy to get around if you're an English speaker in Singapore. Very, very convenient for me. Here on page 261. The Singaporeans learnt their English, but in no deep sense learnt English habits of thought or culture. Even the most casual visitor will discern a lack of inwardness with the language. What did transpire, however, was an estrangement from Chinese culture. Perhaps it would have happened anyway, as part of the assimilation to the culture of a modern economy. A Singaporean Hokkien who speaks English as his first language does not seem exactly Chinese to someone fresh from Amoy. So little does he know or even care about his heritage. So different is he of mentality. But how far the unfamiliarity is simply an aspect of the general disparity between modern and traditional identities, and how far it comes of the Singaporean losing his ancestral language, nobody can really say. And this reminded me of some friends of mine in Singapore. One of my friends is of Chinese descent, and my other friend is of Indian descent. And my Indian friend was kind of joking around and saying, "Oh, she's a banana." She was like, "Oh yeah, I'm such a banana," and I was like, "Well, what do you mean banana? I don't understand." And it's like, "Well, I'm yellow on the outside but white on the inside because I can't really speak so much Mandarin." He said, "I can speak more Mandarin than she can." And so that was kind of interesting. And actually, Miss Pan goes into some detail about what it means to be a banana and how a lot of the Chinese people in Singapore do feel like they're bananas because they're so cut off from being truly Chinese. Their English is basically native level. They've been raised in an English-speaking environment. A lot of them don't even speak Chinese at home anymore. And what that means as an identity. We don't think about these things so much in the United States because we expect everyone to speak English. But, we also are pushing cultural assimilation, the convenience, but then at what cost? What are you losing when you force everyone to speak English and, kind of act the same way and discourage the differences that separate us, in terms of wanting harmony. Everyone should live together, everyone should be peaceful and get along. But at the same time, are you giving up fundamental aspects of culture that are going to be lost forever? Also is kind of an interesting question. Singapore is a really fascinating place, and this book really kind of filled in a lot of knowledge for me and really get more of a sense of why things are the way they are in Singapore. The Singapore experiment is very, very fascinating, and she devotes a lot of time to Singapore. So this was actually a really cool book to read while I was in Singapore because it was like, I felt like I was getting a lot of behind the scenes information. Some of the later chapters in here, she talks about food culture, and Amoy Food, the giant Chinese import-export company. She talks about how fortune cookies were an American invention, which I think a lot of people know that. She also talks about Li Shizeng was a renowned Chinese intellectual and educationalist, and he happened to be in France during World War I and got a lot of the starving people, from soldiers to local people, to eat tofu because he was able to manufacture and distribute tofu on a large level. And that was the first that most of those people, I think, had ever even heard of tofu, let alone eaten it. So he provided tofu during the First World War. Really fascinating random facts in here. Lynn Pan was away from Shanghai, the city of her birth, for 25 years. And when she returned, she suddenly started writing books about it, and she thought, maybe I care more about China than I thought I did, because she thought she was kind of done with China. She lived in Britain and 10 other countries, and she was a really interesting person, and I think a lot of her books are out of print, but they're quite fascinating. If you want to check out Lynn Pan, I would recommend at least Sons of the Yellow Emperor. I hope this video didn't go on too long, and if you're still here at the end, I just want to thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my videos and photos of Singapore, and I'll be back with more soon. See you again.